After seeing that, could you really have fired Steve Jobs?
Executive.
May 1985, Cupertino, California. In a conference room at Apple headquarters, the board of directors asks the 30-year-old founder to step outside. When he is called back in, he has no division, no product, and no company left to run. 9 years earlier, he had started Apple in his parents' house in Los Altos. He was 21. By the time the company went public in 1980, he was worth more than $200 million. In January 1984, he stood on a stage in Cupertino, pulled a small beige computer out of a canvas bag, and introduced the Macintosh to a room that would not stop screaming.
For the first time ever, I'd like to let Macintosh speak for itself.
2 days before that, during the Super Bowl, Apple had run a 60-second commercial directed by Ridley Scott. Gray rows of shaven men sit in a hall watching a giant face lecture them from a screen. A woman in red runs down the aisle with a sledgehammer and throws it. The product itself is never shown, no feature is named, no price is spoken. The name Macintosh arrives in the final line, and then it is over. That is why it is still taught in advertising classes. It did not sell a product, it sold an enemy. The face on the screen was IBM, and the gray men were everyone who had already given in, and the film asked the viewer to pick a side before it asked for a sale. Apple's own board had watched it weeks earlier and hated it, and told the agency to sell the airtime back. The agency sold one slot and quietly kept the other. It ran once, and 4 decades later, it is still the only commercial most people can describe from memory. And then the Macintosh did not sell. It had a beautiful screen, no hard drive, and almost no software. The reviews were rapturous, the reorders were not. By the spring of 1985, sales were running far below forecast. Dealers had stock they could not move, and Apple posted the first quarterly loss in its history. About 1,200 people lost their jobs. Inside the company, the blame settled on one man. Steve Jobs had recruited John Sculley away from Pepsi 2 years earlier, with a single sentence about sugar water and changing the world. For a while, the two of them were inseparable. Then the losses started, and they stopped agreeing on anything, on price, on advertising, and above all, on who actually ran the Macintosh division. In May, Jobs began quietly counting votes. The plan was to remove Sculley while Sculley was on a business trip to China. Sculley found out before the plane left. He took it directly to the board and asked them to choose between the chief executive and the founder.
And so the board then brought Steve and me together, and they said, Steve, we want you to step down from running the Macintosh division, not get fired. You know.
Jobs was stripped of every operational responsibility he had. He kept the title of chairman and was given an office in a building with almost nobody in it. He called it Siberia. For the next 4 months he drove in, sat in a room with a phone that did not ring, and watched the company he had built move on without him. On September 17, 1985, he resigned. He told the board he was starting something new and taking a handful of Apple engineers with him. Apple sued him within the week for breach of his duties as chairman. Then he sold his stock, not some of it, all of it, more than 5 million shares, every share he owned except one. He kept the single share so the company would still mail him the annual report. He was 30 years old, and he was out.
What can I say? I hired the wrong guy.
That was Sculley?
Yeah, and he destroyed everything I'd spent 10 years working
And
for.
why I didn't go to Steve Jobs and say, Steve, let's figure out how you can come back and lead your company. I thought it would drive Apple towards bankruptcy.
The new company was called Next. Jobs paid the graphic designer Paul Rand $100,000 to produce one logo. Rand said he would deliver one solution and no alternatives. Jobs took it. He built a factory in Fremont where the machines were painted to match the walls. He hired the people Apple had trained. In 1987, Ross Perot invested $20 million for 16% of a company with no product, and told reporters that he had once passed on a young Bill Gates and had no intention of making that mistake twice. On October 12, 1988, at Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco, Jobs unveiled the NeXT computer. It was a black magnesium cube, exactly 1 foot on every side, with a display and an operating system that were genuinely years ahead of everything else on the market. Developers who used it said nothing else came close. The price was $6,500, and the machines it competed against cost half that. It did not sell. The universities it was designed for could not afford it. The corporations that could afford it did not want it. In 1989, Canon put in $100 million, and the money bought time instead of customers. The Fremont factory had been built to produce 150,000 machines a year. NeXT sold roughly 50,000 in its entire life. In 1993, Jobs shut the hardware business down. He laid off more than half the company, sold the factory, and kept the one thing that had always been better than everyone else's, the operating system, Next Step. Almost nobody used it, but at a physics laboratory outside Geneva, a British engineer named Tim Berners-Lee wrote the first web browser and the first web server on a NeXT cube, because it was the only machine on which he could build them quickly enough. A few years later, 2 programmers in Texas built Doom and Quake on the same hardware. The most influential software of the decade was written on a machine that failed. He was 38, and he was holding the one thing Apple would have to buy. How the company that pushed him out ended up paying $429 million for that failure. By 1993, Steve Jobs had been gone from Apple for 8 years, and the company he built in exile had just stopped making computers. But there was a second investment from those years that he almost never discussed. In February 1986, he had paid George Lucas $5 million for a small computer graphics division and committed $5 million more in capital. He renamed it Pixar. It was supposed to sell expensive imaging hardware to hospitals and government agencies. It did not. For 9 years it lost money, and he covered the losses himself, eventually more than $50 million. He tried to sell it more than once. Nobody wanted it either. On November 22, 1995, Pixar released Toy Story. It was the first feature film animated entirely on computers, and it made more than $360 million worldwide. 1 week later, Pixar went public. It was the largest technology offering of the year, and by the closing bell, Steve Jobs was worth over $1 billion. The money came from the business he had almost given up on, not the one he had spent a decade defending. And in Cupertino, Apple was on the brink of ruin. Sculley had been forced out in 1993. Michael Spindler followed him and lasted 3 years. In February 1996, the board handed the company to Gil Amelio. Amelio inherited a company that had lost more than $800 million in a single year, whose market share had fallen below 5%, and whose operating system was more than a decade old and still could not do the basic things every competitor's system did. The project meant to replace it, called Copeland, had absorbed years of work and hundreds of engineers. In August 1996, it was canceled without ever shipping. Apple now needed a modern operating system, and it needed one immediately, and it no longer had the time to write one, so it went shopping. The first call was to a company called B, founded by Jean-Louis Gasset. Gasset was the executive who had taken over the Macintosh division in 1985. He had been handed Jobs' job the same week Jobs lost it. He wanted somewhere around $275 million for BOS. Apple offered roughly half. Neither side moved, and the talks went cold. And then someone at Apple picked up the phone and called NeXT. On December 20th, 1996, Apple announced that it was acquiring NeXT for $429 million in cash, plus 1.5 million shares of Apple stock paid directly to Steve Jobs. The deal closed in February 1997. Read that sentence carefully, because almost everyone remembers it wrong. Apple did not hire Steve Jobs back. Apple bought the software he had spent 11 years and several $100 million of other people's money building for a market that never showed up. He arrived as part of the inventory. His title was Advisor to the Chief Executive. He had no division, no authority, and no seat on the board. In June 1997, he sold all 1.5 million Apple shares he had just been paid, keeping one, exactly as he had in 1985. The sale became public, and Wall Street read it as the founder betting against his own company. 3 weeks later, the board removed Gil Amelio. On September 16, 1997, Steve Jobs became interim chief executive of Apple. He had been gone 12 years, and he later said the company was about 90 days from running out of cash. In 6 weeks, he cut roughly 70% of the product line. He took $150 million from Microsoft and stood on a stage in Boston while a hall of loyal customers booed Bill Gates on the screen behind him. In August 1998, he shipped the iMac. And in March 2001, Apple released Mac OS X. Under the new name and the new interface, it was Next Step. The same core, the same architecture, much of the same code, taken directly from the failed product of the failed company. Every Macintosh built since then has run on it. So does the iPhone. So does the iPad, the watch, the earbuds, and the box under the television. More than 2 billion devices, all descended from a black cube that almost nobody bought. Apple did not save Steve Jobs. The product nobody wanted saved them both. He was not wrong about it. He was 11 years early.
After seeing that, could you really have fired Steve Jobs?
Executives are replaceable, but vision like his is not.